Welcome to our book talk series, where tonight we're celebrating Tudor City in at least a couple of talks, and with three people here on the screen that are going to continue a dialogue. The book, of course, that you've, I hope, been able to hear a talk by its author, Larry Samuel, is on the history of Tudor City. And we are also, we played that in the 40 minutes before we're beginning just now. And also there was a bonus film that we put in because about a year ago in June 2019, the architect and documentary filmmaker and author James Sanders, who happens to be one of the board of the Skyscraper Museum, and also grew up in Tudor City from age 4 to 10, talked with great enthusiasm and not really nostalgia, because part of it was the romance of childhood, but part of it was through the eyes of an architect who appreciates so much the urban design that is represented by this real jewel of New York, but really also brilliant real estate venture of Tudor City. So if for those who haven't had a chance to listen to either Larry or tuned in a little bit late and didn't catch all of James Sanders' earlier pre-recorded talk, I urge you to go back to our website, to the page with the link that is both on our page here and you'll find easily through our homepage, to listen to both talks, because this format that we've developed for our virtual programming takes as its idea pre-recording a talk and then having a live discussion in the webinar. That seems to allow us more time, a little bit of adventure in the way that we draw out some of the issues. And in the dialogue that I hope we'll have tonight, to continue to ask each other questions, but also entertain your questions that you'll be able to type into the chat box and will be relayed to me while I'm speaking. So our other speaker is Konrad Wass, who you see here, I hope, who is, as I said, an architect and a Tudor City resident. He has a fabulous terrace apartment that I think he'll show us a view of, but he's also been the steward for the building as a member of the co-op of his section in the restoration of some necessary work over the aging of the building that conforms to the requirements of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And so he has some wonderful forensic shots of the deteriorated metal frames of the terrace top. And that raises the issue of this continuing life of the buildings. Now, Larry in his talk and James in his have both talked with great affection and connection to the place that they live. Larry is part-time there, but he's in Florida, and part of the reason we're in a virtual program tonight, other than everybody these days is doing virtual programming, but we had hoped to have a lecture in the space, and we had kind of held on to that hope for quite an amount of time. But because he's in Florida, he's not allowed to come to New York anymore, and so he would be in quarantine. So we're taking advantage of our situation in all of the cases, including, for those of you who don't know about it, the semester lecture series that we're doing called Rewriting Skyscraper History, to bring together far-flung people and to take advantage of this format so that we can really have a conversation, because when we do a lecture in the museum, we're always running out of time. So here we have a lecture, and before I begin to run out of time, let me launch into my slides, share my screen, and when I do so, I'll be giving a little bit of the history that particularly interests me as an architectural historian who's interested in both buildings and cities in her special period, the 1920s. So Tudor City stands right in the middle of an area where I know a great deal about a pretty focused amount of building history. But yet Tudor City doesn't quite fall into the picture of modernism, which is usually the way the story of the 1920s is told, this kind of evolving story of a shift from European influence of history, which is the kind of genre into which Tudor City falls, to an attraction to European modernism that begins to play out in what we call Art Deco in the US from about 1926 or so, the moment of the birth of Tudor City, and then begins to become a dominant stylistic trend through the late 1920s and into the 1930s. So Tudor City doesn't fit that picture. And I'm going to share my screen now and go to my slides, and hopefully this will shared. First, by way of introduction of Larry Samuel, you see the cover of his book released just last spring, or last winter, I guess. And just to show you a couple other of his books, because he is a Ph.D. in American Studies. He has a kind of specialty in cultural history, as you can see from two of these New York City focused of his books. He also writes about psychology and marketing strategies. So there's a very interesting mix of perspectives, quite populist in many of his takes on these subjects. And here you see in a particular focus in the 1960s, both on the 1964 World's Fair and then this cultural history book. He has a whole raft of books, and if you go to Amazon, you can see the wide range of his writings and his interests. But we talk tonight about Tudor City, and we take at this overview a picture from the 1930s. From the New York Public Library, and it shows you the expanse of the project. It also shows you in transition with not all of its buildings built yet, and we'll come back to it again because the particular focus that I want to bring to this initial part of the discussion is something that evolved out of an exhibition that we did last year called Housing Density, Tenements to Towers. And Tudor City, and let me just go back to Tudor City and the other project, real estate and housing development, private development model that Fred French was involved in was Knickerbocker Village on the Lower East Side. Now, you've already heard a little bit about that and certainly a lot about Tudor City. So let's just take a look at Knickerbocker Village, a project that didn't really get out of the ground in time to beat the Depression. So there was little payback in what we're going to elaborate a little bit on the history of the French plan. But here, like in Tudor City, with a different kind of architectural approach, you can see the basic idea of Fred French: buy a lot of blocks of row houses or tenements and replace them at much higher density. Of course, this is in the Lower East Side, just south of the Manhattan Bridge. And this area of New York, of course, was an enormously high density area because the tenements were so crowded together with no back lots, with no park space. The Lower East Side, close to here, was the densest place in the world at the turn of the 20th century. So a model of thinking about how to replace tenements with high-rise towers, which offered up as its counterpart, is its other half, the white to the black of the density in the built environment, the white of the open space. Here, in interior courtyards, a very different architectural solution or strategy than Tudor City, you can nevertheless see the idea of how a private developer would use a model of high-rise housing to replace at about the same density as the crowded, congested blocks of tenement buildings that pre-existed that were demolished in order to build this new housing form. And it was a housing form that was affordable. We'll talk a little bit about the real estate strategy and the way that French raised money from investors. But an important part of this was the affordability of these units. So how do you make modern housing on 19th century congested, outdated, and unsanitary models? Use, we could call it the skyscraper, but use in Tudor City, use the high-rise strategy that you see here in Knickerbocker Village. And here's the courtyard, a very expansive courtyard, maybe not as gracious, not as scenographic as Tudor City, but nevertheless a kind of oasis in the center of one of these courtyard blocks. And for this exhibition that the Skyscraper Museum did with Nicholas Bloom, it called Housing Density, we did an analysis of the density, here you see it today and in 1934, of the number of people per acre. That is the average people per acre, but as you can also see in this diagram by Leo Tamargo, we talked about the built density, or the area that is covered with buildings, but also the area that is open space. And you can see in this solution, the very high density of 800 people per acre, almost as dense as the most dense blocks of the Lower East Side, nevertheless had 47% built area, and the rest of that, over 50% of open space. Another approach by another developer, similar in his strategies as Fred French, was Henry Mandel. And over on the west side, especially here at London Terrace between 8th and 9th Avenues, but he also built over on 7th Avenue, large apartment blocks, usually on corner lots. In this case, he got the entire block for an avenue's width. And London Terrace, which used, similar to Fred French, a kind of development strategy of high density and high amenities that you see in the Tea Party and the kind of the gracious situation of a lounge and uniformed service. And also, as you see in the advertisement for London Terrace, the largest private swimming pool in New York were the kinds of amenities that came along with your rent. London Terrace looks like this today. It's co-opt. It is a highly desirable place to live with probably $1 million apartments. So this density, as in Tudor City, found an urbane clientele who were white-collar workers. And if you listened, or you have a chance to listen to James Sanders talk about You Can Have It All at Tudor City, he paints a wonderful picture of the kind of social life at all classes and all levels, from the fabulous penthouse to the kind of the secretaries who were the girls who didn't commute in the advertisement by Fred French, to the families, of which he was one as he grew up as a young child in the Tudor City townhouse. So the density of London Terrace, 900, even greater than Knickerbocker Village, and arguably greater than Tudor City, is an enormously high density with about 3/4, a little bit more than that, land coverage, and courtyards within. So today was affordable in its day, remains highly desirable today. And in the context of our exhibition, which juxtaposed this kind of private development to public housing and the NYCHA model, where the standard of density was controlled so that it was never more in any NYCHA project from about 250 to about 275 people an acre. So this is almost 3 times as dense as a NYCHA project. And James goes on at length in his talk about this kind of false alternative choice between modernism and nature and super blocks, and the kind of urbanity and park-like and streetscape space of Tudor City. So returning, and I'm just going to really quickly go through this and to direct your attention to, on my side, the left side of the screen, where you see a long bar building. And that is, well, you see two of the sides of a framed street of an apartment complex, which was of the same ilk as Tudor City, but in a very different style. And that was the Beaux-Arts apartments. So finished in 1930, designed by Raymond Hood, together with a colleague of his, Kenneth Murchison. And you see here in this kind of streamlined, modern, the effort and the ideology, in effect, of modernism beginning to kind of brand itself in New York as being the new kind of elite, cool class of pied-à-terre for the urbane client or tenant. You see the boxiness of those buildings in this more aerial view, and you see the gendarme, the doorman is dressed as gendarme, to give you a little bit of the sense that you also see in Tudor City, I think, of a kind of Hollywood scenography, a kind of wonderland almost, or a kind of perhaps pretentious fantasy about lifestyle that naturally goes with the Beaux-Arts apartments, connecting to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, of course. And you can see that these apartments in their marketing brochure have about the same amount of cramped space as many of the Tudor City tiny units, studio units, with the fold-down beds. But you see in the windows, in the horizontal casement windows, and the man looking out, almost you imagine that he's Fred Astaire or Noel Coward, in this modernistic environment that seems like it's straight out of Hollywood. And I'm going to let Conrad take over now, because he's the one that unearthed this wonderful sketch from an early architectural drawing from Fred French's architects that showed a central tower. Each one of the projects, Tudor City and Knickerbocker Village, and other of unrealized projects by French, are part of an archive in the New York Public Library, where the Fred French papers document probably less of the architectural material than the financial papers and the kind of the backup of the penciling out of projects that we want, that I asked Conrad to speak about a little bit. And from the text block of that very same drawing, it says this is, as you can read, the first study of the perspective elevation of a proposed Tudor city that would be managed under the French plan. And here is the French plan. I'm going to read a little bit. Okay, this is my way of introducing Conrad, because there's Conrad center stage here with quite a project in front of him in the restoration of some of the deteriorating. Well, I will go forward so that I can't see Conrad on my screen, but I'm assuming that he's there and that you can all see him. And Conrad, I think I'm going to let you take over now in order to talk a little bit about how you got involved in this whole project and your interest in the French plan, which I know you're going to tell us a little bit about as well.
Carol, thank you very much. This is an extraordinary opportunity. And Lawrence, thank you for your presentation and your book on Tudor City. I guess where we have to start is to ask ourselves, why is Tudor City and Fred French's vision important to discuss in the first place? And what would be the model of urbanism that we can draw from his concepts? We often have a difficulty seeing the context within which original decisions, whether they be financial, architectural, or otherwise, made. Scholars and historians offer us some rear view into the time frame, and I think what we're trying to accomplish perhaps today is to see the benefits which were shown in Lawrence's book of a presentation that not only illuminates the context, but also the timeline and the changes over 90 years in Tudor City. And I think this is somewhat germane. This historical resiliency over 90 years and this enduring viability as it's changed and waned and ebbed over the years can be, I think, traced to four major elements or four major themes, if I may. First is urbanism and neighborhood. The second is branding. The third is finance. And the fourth I call locational consistency. And we can talk about all those in order, and hopefully Lawrence will be able to, and I will be able to, and Carol discuss different aspects of it. In terms of, before we get to the finance concept, I think one has to sort of double back a little bit and understand the motivation of why Fred French chose these parcels and this location in the city to take his next development. And as you've heard in Lawrence's book, he was a very significant and serious experienced builder by this time that had built many, many buildings, that was able to marshal the forces of construction, of management, of acquisition, and eventually finance. What distinguished, and we'll take this slightly out of order based on Carol's slides. What you're looking at is a very early example of an offering plan or marketing plan that essentially purports to give the prospective purchaser an understanding of what is being offered and what kind of return on investment someone would get. This is the Tudor City second unit offering plan, which is the offering plan of the Manor. And the Manor is located on the my lower left-hand side, as you can see there. What's of interest to us before we get into the mechanics of this is, if you may remember, in Tudor City currently, there are two major parks that are essentially the lungs, the essence, the neighborhood, as Lawrence says, the village green. These are in fact not evident in the original offering plan. If you can see, and I know, Carol, if you can point, if you can't, we'll just assume.
Yeah. Okay.
You have in the middle 42nd Street, which runs there back, and on either side, before the tall towers in the back, is where the parks are located. Originally, I think French had an acquisition strategy of building those parks out. Carol asked me a little bit earlier, what was my thinking or my thesis why he didn't do that. And I think to understand that, we have to then go back to the context. The context we have here is a property that is being developed towards the end of the Roaring 20s. It's a property that, in fact, is, in the words of Jane Jacobs, maybe we can go back one slide for a second. Oh, too far. Perfect. That is being developed in 1925, 1926. It's a property that has had historical exposure but became run down. In the words of Jane Jacobs, it has lost its permeable borders to make the neighborhood a viable, self-generating neighborhood. What you're looking at there is the Second Avenue L, and you can point at the elevated subway, and you're looking at also what we call the sales office, which is really quite something. It is the beginnings of demolishing of a neighborhood of 4-story brownstones, which have deteriorated because on the east side of the border you had industry, meat packaging plants, which were noxious and really not very desirable. On the south side, eventually you had the Con Edison plant and various other industrial uses. And of course, on the west side, you had the elevated roadway. So this became an isolated neighborhood which suffered deterioration. As the caption shows, Fred acquired the property for about $23 a square foot for the 7 acres. What's fundamentally interesting, and I think germane to this project, is that 2 years before that, he acquired a property on Fifth Avenue, which is the Fred French building, and I encourage everyone to see that, for an astronomical sum of money, about $230 a square foot. What that tells us is that he had great success in that particular building in terms of development and rental. It was located within walking distance to the new transportation hub, to the Grand Central. It was a huge success. Armed with that success, he then looked at the surroundings, looked at the supply of potential purchasers, renters, occupants, and saw that there was a great move by the end of the 20s to move out to the suburbs. So he was able to take a look at the land value, and here is an example of different types of land value tied to use. The industrial uses on the waterfront in the East Village were really about $5 a square foot. And my recollection is that Zeckendorf, when he purchased a large portion of the meat packaging plants many, many years later, had essentially paid $5 to $7 a square foot. Tudor City with Fred French was acquired very quickly, surreptitiously in a sense, within a space of a month or two for about $25 a square foot, and a deteriorated, failing neighborhood. To compare that to office use in the area, we have the Chrysler building, which was built a little bit later, and that acquisition price was about $48 a square foot. Having a full circle and coming back to the notion why Fred French didn't build the parks, I think there are three theories. One is that the acquisition price of Tudor City was so low that he could essentially forego the additional income to make the project work, number one. Number two, the space of building, or the timeline of building the different units, the different buildings in Tudor City, pushed against what eventually became, and if I can say, October 29th, which is the, I believe, Black Tuesday or Black Monday. And 91 years ago, the stock market did a significant hiccup, as it possibly may have done today. I don't want to dwell on that, but it is an interesting occurrence. So in a sense, I think to be able to, over time, develop other pieces of the property and then run into, over the next 2 or 3 years, against deterioration of supply, a deterioration of demand for housing, and effectively the depression, it was really easy to see why Fred French didn't proceed at that point in time, and that concept was revived many years later with Harry Helmsley and his approach to the process. And I think the third and final question of why he didn't build initially was, in order, as the marketing plan evolved, he really wanted to attract the commuters going to the suburbs. And one of the items that was very high on their desirability list was, in fact, open space, their personal front yard as they walked up to their housing. And in our case, we can make that analogy that the parks are the front yard. The backyard, where you could barbecue, where you could do sorts of things, where you could meet with your neighbors. And here, that personal backyard was moved up north to the roof, to the various restaurants, as Larry had indicated in his book. So those are some of the things, and I'll stop talking here to let some more oxygen in the room from other folks. But that was my approach to answering that question. Carol?
That sounds great. And I just have a few more slides, which probably illustrate some of the things that you're already talking about. Larry, do you want to chime in about any of these now?
Yeah, just in terms of the space, being on the river, I think has been sort of underestimated, given the health concerns in cities at the time. There was all kinds of concerns about germs in the air, and that, you know, being in the country was healthier. And that's a big reason why some of these folks were leaving the city to go out to Westchester and Long Island and Connecticut, was for health reasons. And I think that's been undervalued. and forgotten about that. That was a major concern in the 1920s. And that in turn was featured pretty prominently in French's advertising for Tudor City, was these cool river breezes, which of course references that there was no air conditioning at the time, but that it was also the greenery was just a healthier place to be. So I just wanted to throw that in the mix there.
Absolutely, fully agreed. This is a fabulous view of First Avenue, and you can see these low row houses that were eventually demolished by Robert Moses in his reconfiguration for the UN plant. That brings us to those of you who may not be aware on this call of the configuration of Tudor City, and that's especially visible with the building on the right. The windows there that are facing the noxious industrial uses are really one common corridor. So there's no residential dwelling units that open up on the right side. They all open up and face the city, which is interesting. It wasn't until you got to 5 Tudor City in that configuration that things changed a little bit. Carol?
Larry, do you want to talk a little bit about your research? I know that you visited the New York Public Library and the Fred French collection, and these slides, the historic slides we're showing here, are all from NYPL. And you can, if those of you who aren't familiar with the website of NYPL called oldnyc.org, there is a map of the city and dots, and if you click on the dots, you see the collection of all of the street views, of which I think Larry has used some in his presentation as well. And these have, the ones that we've included in the PowerPoint tonight, take advantage of the whole neighborhood, where you can see across time the acquisition of the row houses, their acquisition with the signs that say the French plan, here comes Tudor City. But Larry, do you want to talk about how you dug into the history?
Yeah, there were different layers, as there usually are with a history project. Different resources floating around, and then you go to those sources and you find the narrative within those sources. So you sort of had the official history coming from published accounts, newspapers and magazines and what have you. But I found that what was invaluable, I don't think I could have done this project without the Tudor City View newsletters that were published, going back to the 30s up until the late 1960s. And there's a complete set at the New York Public Library. There's a complete set at a couple of other archives. And for weeks, I just sat down at my little table there and read every single issue, and the stories just come through, because I can't go back and interview people in the 1940s and 1950s. And so this was just a direct pipeline to the issues of the community that were in circulation of the time. So I would bet at least half of my book relies on the Tudor City View. And we have with us tonight, by the way, Noel Sherry, who is the grandson, I believe, of the gentleman who edited that incredible publication for 30 years. So a shout out to Noel. And then you have, of course, the oral histories, and I did my best to just interrupt people in elevators, especially older folks, and just ask them stories. Tell me your greatest memory of Tudor City, something a little offbeat. And so there's some of that as well. I think the best one was about this woman who would set up on the little bench looking over the river and take her binoculars every day and look for Soviet subs coming up the river. That was one of the better stories. She was sort of legendary at the time. And then the whole story about the mistresses was, of course, incredible, because I love The Apartment, Billy Wilder's movie. And it was really true that Tudor City, you know, in the 40s and 50s was basically a red light district at some level, where especially military personnel would come in and find some company. So that was, you didn't see that published in the New York Times. All yours.
Well, yeah, for those of you who haven't heard James Sanders talk about his childhood memories of Tudor City from, you know, the perspective of the children's playground rather than the adults' park, and the kind of wonderful, rich experience of this kind of stage set being your neighborhood, but also being a real place that lives, where you live every day, but that lives in your memory so vividly. James has really beautifully evoked that in his talk, which is the kind of love letter to Tudor City. And well, it was, you know, Winston Churchill who famously said, we shape our buildings and they shape us. And that certainly seems to be true of residents of Tudor City. It engenders this incredible affection, a kind of intense curiosity about the history of the buildings, and perhaps now, Conrad, we should look a little bit more into that history of Fred French too, because he really was the genius enabler, a true visionary in seeing the possibilities of this promontory place, of reimagining it completely as a residential enclave, and then coming up also with the idea of the French plan. And I don't know if you can see it, but the museum's very own copy of the French plan. And since the slides that Conrad sent me were not very clear, I thought I would just simply read 2 paragraphs from the very opening of this book. That certainly gives you a flavor of the businessman Fred French and the promoter as well. Because this is the way that the French plan starts. Never before, as far as we know, have the public been permitted to participate in the erection and ownership of income-producing buildings and obtain their rightful share of the profits. We have accomplished this by means of the French preferred and common stock. And Larry in his talk showed you one of those stock certificates. And paragraph 3 is, never before, as far as we know, has the man with $100 to invest been given the same terms as the man with $100,000. We have accomplished this by refusing to modify our plan, no matter how much stock the investor may wish to purchase. And so, Conrad, if you want to take over as I try to locate the slide that's going to show us a little bit about this economics, you can talk about that.
Oh, absolutely. Here's a good slide. If we can stay there for a second, and either or. I think the French plan is really a precursor of today's capital formation strategy called crowdsource funding. Fred French had, in fact, been using and developed and expanded the French financing plan for a number of years before he got to Tudor City. However, in essence, what this was that he was able to sell about $50 million worth of secondary equity funding from small investors of $100 each, approximately. He had a 150-person sales force, and which then went door to door in some cases, or in other formats, to be able to sell to individuals 3 things. 1, the safety of principle. If you can go one more slide, I think that's evident right there, and then we'll go back to this. Oh, I'm not sure where it is. Might be the next one. Oh, that's perfect. So 3 things. He wanted to be able to have an investor invest their capital with 3 things to consider: safety of principal, increase of earning power, and increase of principal. Safety, earning power, and return on and return of principal. And what he essentially did was he issued something called a preferred stock, which in essence is the ability to quote a return on the stock that will be distributed from any profits generated during that year prior to distribution of any other equity participation. So if someone invested, and we can go back one slide, I think, to the graph if we can, perfect. If someone invested $100 or so, he would be able to get at the end of the first year a preferred return of 6% on the $100. And then that would continue for the space of 10 years, where at the end of 10 years, they would be retiring that $100. He would receive $10 as a 1/10 payment in the first year, $10 as 1/10 payment the second year for a period of 10 years, in addition to be able to get 3% return. So in essence, at the end of 10 years on the preferred return, the investor was supposed to get $133 for his $100 investment. Having then accomplished that, and that preferred return was retired, he also received, at the time of acquisition, he received 1 share of common stock with no par value. It wasn't worth anything, but it represented control and future growth of the company. Fred French issued 1 share of common stock to the investor and 1 share to himself. Presumably at the end of 10 years on a net operating income where there was a profit, then the owner, the investor, would split evenly with Fred French any future profits. This graph is a little bit complicated, but in essence, and I don't want to delve into this significantly, but it shows you what happens where mortgage, and the Fred French application to this was essentially that 50% of the total cost of the investment was funded by debt from banks, and 50% of the total investment was funded by investors that have preferred equity or preferred return. This is significant in that, if you remember, part of the major problem of the Depression is with high debt ratios on properties and that exuberant expansion, people were unable to pay the debt when the income disappeared. Here in this case, because the debt was less than 50% or at 50%, for the great majority of his investments, Fred French was able to retain control and not go bankrupt. There is a small caveat. The small caveat is that a preferred return, and please, I am not a stock investor or a banker or a real finance person, so I stand to be corrected. But my understanding is that non-cumulative shares, dividends, are dividends that are posted only if there's profit. If during, let's say, the Depression, there is no profit, you don't have a declaration of dividends. But you don't have the right, in fact, you still retain the ownership, but you don't get the benefit of the dividend. So, and to some extent, Fred was able to put together a system that allowed him to have immediate access to crowdsource funding and capital to start the construction, to be able to gather all the properties, and then brought in the banks to further the construction themselves.
So this is, sorry to interrupt, but this is such a perfect example of the 1920s stock market boom and bubble, right?
Yes.
And every aspect of it, it just applies to real estate rather than to railroads or U.S. Steel. Can I ask Larry to comment if the newsletter of Tudor City revealed to you anything about the Depression, in the context of how the news or how the economics of Tudor City was reflected in the hard times?
I don't remember ever seeing any mention of economics really in the Tudor City View. It was it was not an official like house publication endorsed and sponsored by French. There was a line between them, but French, supported what was being written, but he didn't use it as a form of propaganda either. And you have to remember that that newsletter was for residents. It was, it was for don't put your plants on the windowsill, or the UN might buy us. It was those kind of things. The investors, for the most part, were the outside community. It was Wall Street, to be honest with you. And down on Wall Street, Fred French was better known for his financing plan than he was for Tudor City or any of his other sort of real estate developments. He was looked as a finance man. So there was a clear line between what was going internally within the community and the wheels operating behind the scene from a financial standpoint.
Well, and we want to leave some time to talk about the building fabrics and the restoration of the buildings. But Larry, just in case some of the people haven't had a chance to listen to your lecture yet, please let everybody know what happened to Fred French post-depression.
Oh, okay. Yeah, in 1936, very suddenly at age 52, Fred French dies. It's reported in the New York Times as a heart attack, but I've done a lot of work in this area on a recent series of books, and I can tell you that that suicides are usually not reported as such to protect family embarrassment, and I've heard it from sort of a friend of a friend of a friend who knew somebody who was on the scene at the time, believe it or not, going back that far. That he did shoot himself in his beloved swimming pool. He was a health nut. He loved to walk. He didn't like cars or subways. That's part of the reason he built Tudor City. But that is what I understand. I'm not sure there's any way to prove it. But tragically, he dies because around that time he was in a big financial hole, partly because of the French plan, but also because of Knickerbocker Village. But it's around that time, within the next year or two, where the city starts coming back, the country starts coming back, and it's just tragic that he didn't live to see what was probably the heyday of Tudor City in the post-World War II years.
Quite so, and I think part of the problem with Knickerbocker Village is because of the Depression, the equity component that was provided by the Fred French plan didn't really exist. So we were looking to the federal government to be able to subsidize the expansion of construction financing, the expansion of underwriting debt, and to problematically that in fact became one of the first, I think, public finance housing projects. And I'm sure Carol knows more about that.
That's right. Knickerbocker Village was bailed out with federal money, and in fact, Frederick Ackerman, who later went on to be the technical advisor and basically the planner for all NYCHA projects from 1933, was in charge of Knickerbocker Village, the transition from the private market to public funding.
This slide is really interesting because it shows the incredible competency of Fred French. Fred French started a vertically integrated business, which was not really common at that time. In 1910, he started the Fred French Construction Company with architects and builders on staff. By 1915, he had the Fred French Management Company. By 1923, he had the Fred French Security Company, which sold stocks. By 1925, that matured into Fred French Investing Company, which essentially owned the initial land and then issued those preferred non-cumulative stocks. And by 1928, because of all the buildings he had owned and built, he started the French Operations Company, which effectively allowed him to collect funds at each individual level of investment, which was quite extraordinary. This building, if you look at the title at the very bottom of the right-hand corner, this was built, I believe, on 1927, and it either looks like May 2nd of 1927, not quite sure, but the emphasis here was the speed of construction. And this is a segue, I think, into what Carol might want to talk about at some point, and I will, as to what happens to that steel. And here you have essentially me looking at what may have been a difficult problem for everyone. The steel that you saw in the previous slide, and you can actually see that specific beam on the water tower up there, had deteriorated so badly that we had to undertake a complete removal of the masonry work in the building to be able to rebuild the steel to structural qualities. Now, having said that, we were, of course, being in the New York City landmarks district, we really had to be able to take everything apart, rebuild it, and put it back together without anybody noticing. Perhaps they noticed because we did get building permits, but needless to say, it was a complex series of work that took place over 2.5 years. This is something that every building in Tudor City, and quite frankly, every building over a certain age, has to undergo in New York City local law 11 inspections, which are masonry inspections. And those inspections identify the areas which might be problematic. And then you are required to be able to fix those. And so here's a particular case of what we did. You can barely see through the picture. You can see some of the other aspects of Ford Foundation building. Towards the center of the slide, a little further up, you can see the Daily News building and some of the other Tudor City buildings. If you want to advance a tiny bit further, I'd be delighted. One more, please. So here's something that's of interest. If we could go back a slide, as we took all the masonry down, and Carol, you can point to that center terracotta piece, which is slightly whiter in color, or lighter. That, in fact, is a reproduction stone because the original was so significantly deteriorated that we had to rebuild it based upon the original molds. And we integrated that back into the system. We backed the exterior brick facing with concrete block, as you can see there as well. And we rebuilt most of the steel. If you could advance the slide, perhaps one or two. Here's one of these wonderful areas where hidden underneath the netting, as I'm sure you'll see some of our other neighbors and friends in Tudor City, which are undergoing similar processes of being able to counteract the deterioration of weather and natural forces in the building. Go ahead. Now, this is a mathematical puzzle. One has to take everything down, number the stones, to be able to then find the stones where they are. So it's just a magnificent, large puzzle that you have to put back together. And unfortunately, it can't really be just on Sunday morning when you're having coffee. This has to be done quite quickly. So this was a wonderful opportunity to be able to utilize some great workmen and to be able to provide our shareholders with a stability and with a safety of their investment that will go on for many years forward. Go ahead. So this is essentially what we're looking at. Is at the top of that picture, you can see the water tower, which is indicative of some of the things we didn't really talk about, which is the notion of branding. I think Fred French's genius lied in a notion of lifestyle branding, what we call that today. A country home on 42nd Street, the marketing, the architecture worked on opposite ends of the 1920s. If those of you who are old enough to remember Horn and Hardock, which was a magnificent restaurant concept, affordable restaurant concept. There was a Horn and Hardock on 42nd Street, and I think either Lexington or 3rd, I'm not sure. But their notion was time is money. Less work for mother because she now works in the office building. So she could be able to run out, get a sandwich, get some soup, take it home, do whatever is necessary. And that notion of expediency and efficiency was for the public office persona, while the branding side, as Lawrence has pointed out, of Tudor City is about the private notion of home. Your home is your castle, a consistency of messaging. My favorite advertisement was, do you travel 7,500 miles a year to get to work? And that essentially was moving out to Westchester or moving somewhere towards Long Island. And Fred's approach was, look how close I am to the center of the city. I could live here. I could walk to work. I wouldn't have to do anything else. So that branding, that consistency of message, that architectural iconography, and that separation of home versus work, the segmentation of land use that acquiesced and masticated in 1916 with the zoning resolution of residential, commercial, and industrial sections, was in fact part of what Fred French's genius, to be able to locate within the heart of the city, the main transportation-centric point of Grand Central, an incredible neighborhood.
Yep.
Carol?
Yeah, and Times Square and the theater district,
Exactly.
within walking distance was a big deal as well.
And Conrad, this is your view, right?
It is. It's actually, well, let me see where we are. Yes, it is a view from my office. So I am incredibly blessed to be able to look out the window and say somebody did something absolutely wonderful, and we have and are encouraged about the responsibility of taking care of this for the next 100 years. And while at the same time being the beneficiary of his urbanism and his plan and his model of high density or medium to high density, and the notion of having consistent, coherent neighborhood, which then allows us to live comfortably.
Well, this particular slide is so phenomenal because it's such a summary of the ages of architecture in New York, and in such spectacular landmarks. And I know that if you look the other way from the same terrace, you see the UN. So there's kind of everything in terms of the 20s and the iconic Chrysler building in front of it, and to my left you see a glass box tower, and just beneath that, the setbacks that are determined by the 1916 zoning law. You see other curtain wall buildings, and of course the monumental and the really awe-inspiring Ford Foundation building. So, as a kind of summary image of the kind of utter romance and genius, as well as the heterogeneity that's so characteristic of New York, this slide really kind of tells it all. I think it's a good slide to leave on, and as we kind of conclude in our very last 2 minutes, there was one question, and so maybe Larry would be able to answer this, because someone wanted to hear more about Douglas Ives, the designer and I think lighting designer, and maybe Conrad, you know more, and his role, to expand on his role in Tudor City. Can either of you do that quickly?
Conrad,
Yeah.
it's all yours. I just know he was an in-house architect, that was primarily responsible, but I don't know his background.
He doesn't get enough respect. He's the Rodney Dangerfield of our profession to a great extent, but he was extraordinary in his ability to interpret Fred French's overall concepts into a very tight, very convincing vision. If you take a look at the French building on Fifth Avenue, look at the iconography at the very top, you'll be able to see some of his finest qualities of his work in the office, is my understanding. Past that, I think he was a tremendously talented individual who simply felt that it was in his best interest to work under a larger umbrella, a larger marketing umbrella. And that's all I know. I'm sure there are experts on at the AIA or various places on him, but that's my knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's 7 o'clock, and when we need to wrap up, and certainly to thank you both, Larry for inspiring this evening, and Conrad for giving us everything from well, the first foundational financial document up to the expenditures that are necessary in order to keep the life of these buildings as magnificent as they were when they were conceived back in the 1920s. So I thank you both very much. I thank James Sanders also for his ode to Tudor cities that I direct everyone to see on our website. And night, everybody.
Thank you.